Hey, everybody, how's it going? Thank you so much for joining me this afternoon. I think we've got a pretty interesting stream. This one has events kind of moving on us. I planned this originally with all of the different debate going on with parental rights and CRT, all the different ridiculous hot takes coming from the left on parents and their role in their child's education. But kind of as I was preparing for this, things have just gotten crazier and crazier. More and more details have come out. And then it all kind of culminated yesterday in some pretty ridiculous actions by the left in the Virginia election. So we're going to be getting to all of that. But my guest today joining me is the Prudentialist. Thanks for coming on, man.
Well, thanks for inviting me. Happy to be here.
Absolutely. And make sure if you, for some reason, have not checked out his channel, I've got his channel and his Twitter linked below. But like I said, when I was first setting this up, I was kind of looking at all the different uh, ridiculous hot takes that have been coming out. But because, of course, we've had this debate over critical race theory, Chris Rufo kind of leading the charge on the right, bringing awareness to this. You've got a very organic movement with parents, and it got so much traction that you actually had the school board associations sending out a memo or a request to the FBI to basically treat parents as domestic terrorists, and I did a video on that. So you would think that with kind of all of this, you would see the left maybe back down, or they would at least change tactics in some way. But not only did they double down, we started seeing some really insane takes. You started seeing them really accelerate the logic of teaching this stuff to students. And so let me see if I can bring this one up real quick. We started seeing share screen here. We started seeing a lot of articles like this one, where parents claim they have the right to shape their kids' school curriculum. They don't, right? We started seeing a lot of takes like this. We also see, where is it? We have a lot of Twitter big brains and blue checks here coming up with, oh, no, not this one. Where was it? Just had found it. Yeah, but
I see we're just scrolling through your bangers here.
yeah. We're just rolling through the feed. But no, we had this guy here who was talking about how if parents don't have degrees in physics or chemistry or math, then there's simply no hope for them having any input into what their children are learning. And we're just seeing take after take like this from mainstream leftist blue checks, op-ed writers all over the place. And I expected, like I said, I expected the left to double down. I didn't really expect them to back off the CRT stuff, but I certainly did not expect to see a flurry of people just saying the quiet part out loud, as people have come to say all the time. I did not expect to see a bunch of people issuing opinions about how actually parents have basically no rights over their children, no rights to what they're learning, and basically just shut up, sit down, and we control your children's thoughts now. I did not expect that flurry. But what about you, Pernicious? What did you think about all this coming out?
Well, like with you, right? I wasn't surprised that they would double down, but I mean, once the data and the info of what was actually being taught, like Chris Rufo does an excellent job making this information known. But even with parents or local, independent people, just saying like, look at these books that are being promoted in class where you can't even advertise them because they're considered pornographic. I and then to see, not just the blue check marks, but to see parents and school board members essentially say that no, this is a good thing that we're teaching, like this is great. And like you had in the thumbnail, like I think it was what in California, they were taking like a group of kids that were obviously under 18 to like a gay bar in California. We've got books that are talking about the gender queer experience. and they're defending it. And someone had posted the other day about, those typical pre-election lawn signs that you see everywhere. And there was one that was just very adamantly saying, keep parents out of classrooms. And so, yeah, the quiet part is being said out loud. But what I find the most interesting is just how far the religiosity of it goes, where just the even your average ordinary parent is ready to defend this and double down, almost in a sort of sacrificing your kids to Moloch is good actually kind of take.
Yeah, here's another one that I really loved. This was I can't possibly think of teaching my own children. It would just be an uh, insane amount of responsibility to actually consider what they should. Not even teaching my own children, but just basically, education is this mystical thing that's way too complicated for your normal dumb parent brain to comprehend. And I just thought this is particularly hilarious because we're looking at a school system that is just an abject failure. Like, we've been watching standards plummet. We've been watching the ability of students to comprehend basic reading and math at grade level just take a nosedive for decade after decade. But now we're getting all this, like, how education is just way, it's way too complex. And even though the people who the more professional and credentialed our education system has become, the more it has failed. You as a parent simply cannot make basic decisions about what your children have access to in school.
No, and what makes it worse is that every attempt to correct these like blatant inequities, whether it's through funding or bond projects or even greater interventions about, say, the achievement gap, right? Like with No Child Left Behind. Like George W. Bush pushes this bill and this law, Nickelby gets passed under the guise of, racial corrections of the achievement gap, or we're going to equalize it. It's a civil rights issue. And what immediately follows, right, is that we see this sort of weird, like, quasi equalization. But what inevitably comes true across the country is just cheating scandal after cheating scandal. I think one of the most infamous ones is, the El Paso Independent School District was infamously in trouble with the federal government over cheating and falsifying like test results to make sure that things work. And I think that this is also another part of just parental like abdication of responsibility. It's 2021. The internet has been, a thing in our lives for a good chunk of my lifetime. I know I'm a few years younger than you, Auron, but you have this point now where parents are just like, screw it. Just give them the iPad while I'm going down the grocery store and picking things up in the cart, or let them learn online and figure it out. And I think it really shows that how far it's gotten, in terms of parental issues, but also with kids, where people are lecturing, math and science and other kind of like tutoring videos on like pornographic websites because they know that teenagers and kids are going to be there. Like the absolute state of just where we're at is, without words.
Yeah, and like I said, the fact that this is so closely intertwined with, obviously our political situation. You have this showdown over CRT, and not just CRT, but also just, like you said, the things that schools are doing in the way they're conducting the safety of their students. Obviously, one of the issues that was cited by the School Board Association was the father of the girl who was sexually assaulted by the transgender student in Virginia. Lawton County it was, or I think it was his name. But he is cited as someone who qualifies as someone who should be treated like a domestic terrorist. Why? Because he's at a school board meeting angrily protesting the fact that the sexual assault of his daughter was covered up so that the agenda of the school board could be pushed. The woke agenda of the school board could be pushed. So while this is, of course, an educational issue, it's also a direct safety and frankly, a child abuse issue that is being addressed. And parents are being told, not only do you have no say in what your students are taught, but you also have no recourse if they are abused, if they are subjected to dangerous situations due to the ideology that is being pushed down into the school. And not only do you not have a voice in this, we're going to try to send federal law enforcement after you if you make that voice heard.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right there. And to a fact, it is in Loudoun County, Virginia, and there is an article from Fox that was published just yesterday where the superintendent of the school district compared all of the parental protests to January 6th of this year. And so all that we're seeing is that any time that there is a organic or right wing response to any sort of degeneracy, CRT, parental rights, just the simple fact that this person's kid was sexually assaulted, and the information became very clear that the school district tried to hide it. And even the most basic response is just that, okay, well, you people are domestic terrorists. We are going to make sure that parents are arrested, and we're going to request the FBI to determine that. So no facet of political response at this point is safe. Not, questioning certain things that happened last November, not even questioning the fact that, hey, maybe my school's curriculum is, indoctrinating my children. All of these things are going to be met with the full force of the security state.
Yeah, and the amazing thing is, of course, on top of obviously the Dems kind of bowing to teachers' unions and school board associations, which you would expect, you also have kind of this race in Virginia, the governor's race, which has kind of captured a little bit of popular attention at the moment because it's supposed to kind of be predictive of midterms and then electoral consequences. In the Democratic candidate in that race, Terry McAuliffe, is a former governor of Virginia, and he's wanting to run again. And he really leaned into this culture war aspect of it. He really, again, doubled down on this and made the push against CRT and the parent backlash to it central in the sense that he supported, silencing parents, pushing them out, making the whole thing sound like some conspiracy theory that's been cooked up and has no legs. And of course, with his continued message on this just being to ignore parents, push them to the side, the fact that there's just been this onslaught of mishandled events surrounding this kind of stuff in his own state has really been affecting that race. So there's been what could be direct political consequences here. But before we get to the recent events uh, in uh, in Virginia with the race, I did want to go over one more here. So we, again, like you were saying, we had that incident. I think it was in Florida where they took the elementary students to a gay bar, and then there was this one which was absolutely insane. Let's see here. This was a school in Kentucky where they had a male pageant where the students were dressing up in lingerie and giving principals and different members of the board lap dances. And so I really wore out the meme this week. Uh, they're just evil and want to diddle kids with this week because there's just this onslaught of this stuff again, all right as we're entering this debate about parental rights and whether parents should have any say about what's going on in schools.
I mean, it feels strange because it's just like, I in my senior year of high school they had a male pageant kind of deal, sort of in line with all your sort of senior year superlatives, and I don't think that it would have ever gotten to anything like this. And I'm saying that as someone who's been it's been almost a decade now since graduating, and I just find it so hard to just see how fast things have changed. But at the same time, I'm not surprised because you've got an online culture. I mean, if we want to compare things, right, the long arc of internet history, like the Tumblr crazy people we made fun of a decade ago are now controlling like pronoun, gender, and diversity policy in government, whether it's federal or local. And you have a Generation Z where almost a quarter of them identify as something that is not, heterosexual. So all of this sort of culture stuff, from the internet to access to this kind of information, and parents just kind of not noticing until it gets really blatant, uh, all right in their faces. And I think the funny thing, both with this story in Kentucky, but also but to bring it back to Loudoun County. Loudoun County is in Nova, which is Northern Virginia, and it's close to Maryland and sort of the DC area. It's a very wealthy, well-off county. And to see this kind of response happening, I think is indicative that you can toe the party line, but it's sort of that example of Robert Conquest's first law. You're conservative about what you know most, and what you know most is your family, your kids, and people are finally, I think, kind of responding.
Yeah, absolutely. And so this has had a big impact on the race. I think you were looking up the real Clear Politics polling numbers right before we went on, and you said Youngkin is now up like 8 points,
Yeah, it
right?
was a Fox News poll. The aggregate has Youngkin up by zero point 0.6, but the story that it really comes out, and this is speaking from just somebody who's ran some campaigns, local and state elections, is just you have to embrace the bread and butter issues. It does towing the party line will do you nothing if the state is somewhat remotely competitive or if the district's competitive. And like you had said earlier, the embrace of sort of this culture war topic, like actual bread and butter issues that, people actually care about because it actually affects them, not just some abstraction that you see in Washington. It allowed him to tap into something that gave him the momentum to win. And I think you had said this before this, like we went live, was that um, the argument being that, hey, you have to make these people stand on what they believe in and call it out openly. And watching these Dems and McAuliffe like openly, defend it and push parents to the side and say this is a good thing has made waves.
Yeah, absolutely. And so we saw, again, this is why I'm glad we did a stream on this instead of, because I was going to do a video, but I'm glad we were able to do a live stream, because then last night things got even more ridiculous as let me see here. We had a incident staged, basically. So let's see here. So all of a sudden, you had this flurry of Democratic operatives and news people reporting the fact that 5 people dressed up kind of like the protesters in Charlottesville with tiki torches showed up to Glenn Youngkin's bus and voiced their approval of him and their support for him. And this was supposed to show, obviously that he is the racist and he is the terrible person, and all the people who are supporting him are obviously exactly the kind of people who showed up to Charlottesville. But then people started noticing some interesting details about some of the people who were there. I don't know why they weren't able to find like 5 white guys, because this is clearly a woman, and this is clearly not a white supremacist, unless it's Clayton Bigsby from the Chappelle skit. And so it was quickly pointed out that this was clearly astroturfed. And it's funny because these people really went super hard in the paint over this. Like, it's not like one guy tweeted this out because he thought it was funny. Like, all of the campaign staff, the Virginia Democrats, were like on top of this. Like, this is clear evidence of how hateful and ridiculous and the kind of the nature of Youngkin's campaign. They really thought they had a coup there. And then they had to quickly start deleting it as people pointed out that not obviously one of their white supremacists was black, and that's what happens when the casting director doesn't realize that he's not supposed to use the diversity requirement for the alt-right psyop. But also that one of them was a female, and I think people linked her directly to working on Democratic campaigns in Virginia. And so this quickly became super embarrassing, and they had to delete all their tweets around this.
I mean, yeah, once they started making the connections, like, oh, these individuals are putting out, they're related to the Young Democrats. They worked with the George Mason University, like Democratic Party, or students for McAuliffe and all that. If you're only and they're all in their young, they're all young, they're my age, they're in their mid-20s or younger, and if your only frame of reference is going to be like Charlottesville and the tiki torches and the shirts, I mean, could you not be more obvious about where this is? But I think the best take that came from it all was that this was fake and gay from the start because no journo tried to dox them when the news came out.
Yeah, right. Yeah, if this was real and you had close-ups of all five of these people, they'd all be fired by dinner if it was real.
Exactly.
And that was not the case. But I thought was really interesting is the Lincoln Project stepped up and took credit for this, saying, this group of kind of disgraced GOP conning fundraisers who've kind of worked for the Democrats because they were anti-Trump. And I think Don the Pleb was making a really good point. A lot of people, a lot of kind of mainstream right wingers and blue checks immediately jumped on this because they all hate the Lincoln Project, and with good reason. It's full of people who want to diddle kids and hate the right. But they jumped right on top of this declaration of responsibility. And Don the Pleb pointed out, like, guys, they probably didn't do this. This is like ISIS claiming every terrorist attack. They are taking the heat off the Dems because, like, one of these people actively worked in Democratic politics. It looks like. The idea that the Lincoln Project put this together is great smokescreen to cover for the McAuliffe campaign and take heat off of them. But you're really just turning the animosity the wrong direction, and you're giving away a win. You could have stuck this to the Democrats, but instead you're falling for this claim by the Lincoln Project that it was actually no. It turns out it's just former Republicans, not actually the Democratic Party in that state.
Yeah, and I think that what's been made abundant, and I think Glenn Greenwald was pointing it out, that since Biden took office, that the Lincoln Project has been hemorrhaging supporters and followers and donors to what they've been doing. Sort of like the grift is up. So there's some self interest to keep their the grift going and to keep it alive, to claim responsibility. But you're absolutely right. This was the perfect way to have a smokescreen and to divert attention, despite the fact that all of the people that they managed to successfully identify were working and are currently working for McAuliffe's campaign. So this is a great way to just divert your attention elsewhere. Do not look at the man behind the counter there, sort of from Wizard of Oz.
Now, I want to get into how the Republicans and the GOP are going to mess this up in general here in a second. But let's weave a few super chats in here because I've had trouble losing them and I don't want people to miss out. So let's get to a couple of these real quick before we move on. We have Jedi Knight Anakin Cringewalker here. This phenomenon feels like the 1980s USSR nearing the end. Falling empires autistically obsess over minute local details, ignoring their collapse. In some ways, I think that's true. Obviously, like, we have a serious supply chain issue. Gas is skyrocketing. Inflation's going out of control. And yet, kind of focusing down to local politics in Virginia. But at the same time, I think that's as the Prudentialist already pointed out. I think in some ways that's also because it forces people to actually stare the consequences of this stuff in the face, right? Like this anti-white CRT rhetoric and these transgender student policies are coming home to roost in very real ways that are directly impacting parents, and they can't sit around ignoring them, pretending that it's only happening to students somewhere anymore. I think in some far off university in California or something.
Yeah, I mean, they can't make this look like this is an isolated incident in one woke California, San Francisco school district. I mean, we were talking about things in Florida, things in Kentucky, things in Virginia. I mean, these are not all red states. Some of them are purple, some of them are red, some of them are rural. But the other thing, right, that I think Cringewalker kind of hits on in the super chat is that, any sort of empire in a face of decline will always turn inward. And the fact that we're constantly discussing the cultural issues rather than the structural, like, inflation, the gas prices, the supply chain disruption, outside of a few subject matter experts, it gets incredibly, clear that things are not right. The kids are not all right.
Yep. And then let's see, Lance Goebel here, $5. Thank you guys for your donations. I appreciate it. Hey, Prudentialist, when is the next episode of Prudential Kitchen coming out? Are you doing like a kitchen series? Do I not
No,
know that you have a cooking?
Lance has been asking for me to do some kind of cooking show for the last, I want to say, 6 months now, and my current living situation does not allow me to do like an all setup for cooking or kitchening sort of deals, despite the fact that I am known to be a decent cook. So one day, Lance, one day.
All right. Yeah, we need the Dissident Right cooking show is something I'm certainly looking forward to. Just bring different people on, or clean a fish or something. All right. Cringe Walker again. Arch grifter Robin DeAngelo realized that the right attack grift was over this year. She released Nice Racism attacking progressives. The grift goes on, and I think it's interesting. My buddy Bogby from the Good Old Boys made an excellent point, which is, obviously none of this CRT stuff is new. This is all stuff that's been taught in not just colleges, but public schools and corporations on some level for a long time. But what this has really done is given these people like a cottage industry in which they can get checks written to them for giving these lectures. And this is one of the things that Rufo has done a great job of, is putting out, I think he just did a investigation of the AT&T making all of their white employees beg forgiveness for the sin of their skin color. So this is a place for them to write checks and that kind of thing. But by giving it that name, they've also kind of made themselves an easier target, which I think is why you're seeing the backlash that you have.
Yeah, I mean, Rufo's done an excellent job at sort of identifying the pipeline of where this comes from. And, Bog Beef is right that this isn't new. I think he also had said that, this diversity, equity, and inclusion training is the logical conclusion or the successor of sensitivity training from the early aughts and the late and mid 90s. And I mean, this makes sense, right? Because this starts sort of the critical theory aspect in law schools with right around the 70s and 80s, when these sort of critical theorists that we kind of cite all the time are in prominence in their work, or at least their seminal work. And it takes about a couple of decades for it to infect the rest of academia, and by extension, it infects the rest, because you go through academia to get your degree and to get your job and whatever you're going to go to, and it naturally comes with you.
Absolutely. So let's go ahead and get back to the practical application here now. We know that there is this swing in the polls. McCullough should have been a shoe-in. It's a state he's been the governor for. It's a Virginia, sad as it is to say, is a solid blue state at this point. But now he's down in the polls. But we are already seeing, surprise, surprise, a number of stories appear, Red Mirage style, laying the groundwork for, well, don't expect the actual results on election night. Don't expect an actual winner. We got to have all the mail-in ballots, which are now a permanent thing, ushered in by after COVID. There's we can no longer expect an actual result of any given election. We have to have time for everyone to fortify it. So do you expect it? It feels dangerous to me a little bit. It feels dangerous for them to fix another race like this. It feels like they're playing with fire, but it's the same thing. Like, I don't know that they can restrain themselves. Like, I don't know that they have the discipline to just take the L on this one. What do you think?
I'm incredibly skeptical that despite this shift in energy, that it will translate to an electoral success. Are they playing with fire? Yes, but I think that based on their conversations, why having that letter asked to the FBI, the comparison to raging parents as insurrectionists of sorts, I think at that point they feel in a sense, I guess, with hubris, knowing that they have this sort of in the bag. because they have the support of the federal security state. You have the rhetoric and all of, the blue check marks, the lib commentators, the, paper of record claiming that these, parents complaining are nothing more than a product of like right wing grifting. They cannot risk to take the L in the election, because if they do, I mean, you're energizing parents, you're giving the culture war the apps, the necessary like ammunition and fuel it needs to keep going, and it'll be, something that they need to the right. And I think that if they fly, as close as to the sun as they are, I think that they won't take the chance. I think that's the big lesson we've learned out of the last 5 or 6 years, is that 2016 happened, and you have this sort of election wake up call from like Washington and the elite. They're like, "Oh, our thumb isn't on the scale nearly as much as it should have been because this happened." And I mean, immediately after 2016, you had Google saying that we're not going to let this happen again. I think that they know what they need to do to make sure that even though it's close, they'll make it and eke out right at the end.
Yeah, I think you're probably right. Like, I don't. It's interesting. So there's two issues there. Like, what is their level of discipline, that and what they'll do because of that, and then like what would practically be the best for them politically. I know that in some ways the GOP getting a win here would spell a win for parental activism and kind of the CRT pushback and that kind of thing. But in another way, I think it would actually be to the benefit of the left, because oftentimes Republicans, the right conservatives, are so obsessed with just getting a political victory, just getting like someone in office, that where they stop, right? And if they can just get that W, then they just kind of walk away, and then it turns out that the Supreme Court justice or the president or the governor that they got into position of power just becomes a moderate or functionally a Democrat anyway. And they actually lose in the end because, again, the power of the cathedral is the power to manipulate procedural outcomes. Uh, I think it would almost be smarter to just let them have that electoral victory and let the energy dissipate. Like, we got this. We can walk away now and just let the governor do his job. And then it turns out that Youngkin's just, ends up controlled opposition, like 90% of the GOP ends up being anyway, as opposed to actually trying to stomp it out, showing yet again that elections don't work, and and kind of showing people that doing what they're doing is not actually, trying to get people elected is not the solution to the problem. That feels almost like a far more dangerous lesson to teach these people.
So you have two things, right? Like lesson one, say he gets in. Youngkin, before embracing this culture war stuff, was not in any sort of trajectory to win. He was very milk toast in his position. He was not he wasn't someone that who is as right as I can be, would consider voting for him, because I just see him as another like run of the mill GOP kind of stooge-esque character. And if he gets in, then yeah, I would agree with you that the left would be like, okay, cool. The energy dies in the same way that the energy around Trump and who he picked for governorships and whatnot didn't mean anything, because what did you elect? You ran to drain the swamp, and then the swamp is your cabinet. So that would be a very similar thing if they win. I think it would actually be better if he loses, because the energy with the parents doesn't go away. Like what we saw with the California recall, right? Is that as soon as Newsom gets in, the worst things that we expected, started getting passed. One, to punish your enemies, but in Virginia, because if you're going to punish your enemies, like Loudoun County, right, the Nova area, all these, the awfuls kind of acronym, affluent white liberal, or I don't remember it off the top of my head, but like those kind of people, I think are going to kind of turn their cock their eyebrows and turn around and say, maybe this isn't so good. I think that actually losing would be better, because that energy and that momentum stays on the ground where it should be.
Yeah, well, and this is kind of, like, this goes to, Yarvin's counter argument against CRT activism. He said that, you're eventually going to end up with just learned helplessness, where you train these, kind of conservatives to go out, get angry, protest, get someone elected, nothing changes, and then they just, or they can't win election, and they just feel like then there's no energy to push when you really need to push. But I don't know. Like I think you might be right here. I think that uh, if people keep seeing that the process that has been described to them does not work, and it is impossible to actually make change the way they've been taught to make it, then that energy builds up and looks for another outlet. And so it'll be interesting to see. Like I said, I'm just wondering what lessons the right is going to take away from this. Ultimately, no matter how it breaks down, I think the more interesting thing is if the right learns the lesson, that electoral politics is not the avenue, or if they think that if they just target it better, it'll be interesting. But the other thing I wanted to talk about is the larger discussion around parental rights, because obviously we know these are under a lot of attack. I did the video about the total state versus the family, and the way that just different gender identities are being used to basically remove the agency of parents, because if you don't conform to these declared identities, the state can come in and take your child at any moment. And so the identity of child is actually just the destruction of the family, and the authority of parents, and the increase of the authority of the state. But here we see that the gender ideology is not the only wedge, and that the identity ideologies of race are also in play. And like I said, it's very stunning to watch the left come out and just say, point blank, like, parents don't have a right to teach their children what they want, and they don't have a right to control what their children learn in schools. But also, I've noticed the way that the kind of the mainstream right is approaching this seems very dangerous too, because there seems to be a real willingness of people on the right to like have the debate, which is the most dangerous thing, right? I saw Mike Pence is going to have some kind of event or rally or speech discussing the parental right issue, and it's like I don't think you want that. You can't. The only way to not lose this debate is not to have it, because if you are trying to have an open debate about whether parents have control of their children and have the right to their children, or whether the state can just take them and mold them and teach them whatever one at any time, it's only a matter of time before you concede and lose it, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, anytime that something becomes up for debate, the idea that it is an axiom or a rule disappears. It's thrown out the window. Debating this issue shouldn't be anything that the right should do, whether you're a dissident or you work in a chapter or you're a precinct chair for the GOP. Anytime that something like that is debated, it will inevitably be lost. And we're seeing that being chipped away slowly with the gender ideology thing, because there's debates over like hormone blockers with children who are under the age of 18. And I mean, these are things that can do significant irreparable damage to a person's body, no matter what age they take them. And you're trying to implement the idea that a child can consent to something, which Lord knows what the logical conclusion to that is, right? But then the right's messaging about CRT and about critical race theories in the curriculums and the education is that the standard line is we do not want our children to feel ashamed because of the color of their skin. And the only thing that this is, I mean, it's clearly anti-white, and they're not going to say that despite the fact that the GOP's majority base is white. And what's happening is that we're seeing sort of the Nick Land Cracker Factory, situation play out all over again, where all that the Republicans and the right wing does in the United States is that they, I'll just quote it here, captivated by King's appeal to constitutional and biblical traditionalism, by his rejection of political violence, the American conservatism finally came to identify with his dream of racial reconciliation and race blindness, and to accept it as true. And all that they would do now is fail almost entirely to convince the black demographic itself, and would remain open to escalating derision from the left for its empty formalism on race. So I think that that's a pretty good explanation of what we're seeing here. We're not living up to Martin Luther King Jr.'s dream. We're not doing anything that he would want, and they're not recognizing that they're being bludgeoned both in the schools and in Congress because of it.
Yeah, the right has no counter narrative to this other than, like you said, to adopt the left's position and then attempt to hold them to it, and then not give them the tacit agreement and then attempt to hold them to the principles of the left 20 years ago. And that's a real disaster on this because I mean, obviously it's been a disaster for a long time, but you're really getting to those core fault lines. Like, does a parent have a right to not have their children sit in a classroom and learn a blood libel, learn their evil? There's, I I'm not going to go hunting for it because I don't want to just spin this whole stream rolling through Twitter. But there was a mother who was giving testimony to a school board in Virginia about critical race theory, and she said directly, like, my daughter came home and asked why we were evil because we were white. Like, why were we born this way? Why were we born with this original sin? And the GOP just has no ability to talk about this other than, like you said, to just fall into the cracker factory trap there. And so, which I think is a really underrated part of Land's work that people should check out. But uh, I think that you're really starting to hit some bedrock, and the inability of Republicans to do anything but then have a spirited debate about this, and to think that that's going to be the solution. Mike Pence is just going to out debate someone on this issue or something, and that's going to solve the problem is pretty dangerous. But I know you said that you had an article that you wanted to talk about. I hadn't seen it yet, but it sounded interesting. Did you want to describe that real quick?
Oh, sure. Yeah. So Michelle Goldberg in the New York Times a couple of days ago was trying to make the argument that the sexual assault case turned into sort of this right wing grift because, the student was a male identifying as a woman and wore a skirt and went into the men's or women's restroom and assaulted this this teenage girl. And her argument being, well, this of course, got big, but the actual incident itself, and this is one of those like liberal actually kind of posts where it was, well, the gender inclusive bathroom kind of policy didn't happen until 2 months after the assault. So technically, despite the fact that what the real story behind this isn't because of the transgender policy, but because one, well, I mean, it is partially right, but the other thing is that the school board knew about it. The school board tried to hide it under the rug. The parent was arrested for simply protesting about it, and that's where we're at, and that's the issue. So it's one of those sort of like wall of text pieces from the paper of record, the New York Times, but she's simply saying that this is a grift, like all the facts weren't correct. But I mean, what the facts that matter is that you had a self-identified transgender student, sexually assault a teenage girl. They hid it under the bus. They clearly used an ideology to allow this to happen, and they are, arresting parents that are protesting about it. But apparently, complaining that your daughter was raped in her high school apparently is a grift.
Well, you don't have the right to complain about that. You didn't spend 20 years as an educator, so you just can't have an opinion on that. That's ridiculous. Just sit down and watch Netflix. You're pro. But yeah, no. Not only was that the case, but if I remember correctly, the student had been moved from another school because the transgender student had committed an assault previously, and they were covering up that assault and moved them to the new school where then the assault on that man's daughter occurred. And so the well on this is deep, and they were willing to lie and cover up and directly create a dangerous environment knowingly in order to kind of facilitate this ideological push. And just it's funny to watch. It's not funny, it's tragic, but watching all these Dems just try to do this gaslighting. I think Barack Obama had a speech last week, the Republicans bringing all this culture war stuff up to distract us. The guy who burned down, facilitated the burning of American cities, so that he could play up culture war ideology, suddenly finds the culture war distasteful.
Yeah, Barack, if I had a son,
Right,
Obama.
right. Yeah, exactly. And so, I mean, it's very obvious gaslighting. It's very obviously cynical plays to, it, it's when you stop having to run a country and instead you think that you can just sneer and turn to your base and wait for them to clap, and you think that that's governance, um I guess, that it's really just an arrogance that comes with having total control for that long. They just had this soft power mechanism that allowed them to manipulate, elections and outcomes, and they just didn't feel like they needed to actually talk to these people who were beneath them anymore. And now, when the real stuff comes to the surface and they're finally called to account, they think that, just pivoting and going, culture war, what culture war? Let's focus on, well, not the economy because it's terrible, and not gas prices because that's a disaster, and not supply chain issues because there's nothing we can do. But I don't know what they're focusing on now, to be honest, with the Democrats, giving illegal aliens, $250,000, I think
I
was
think it's
the
four
number.
hundred and fifty thousand
Was it that
dollars.
much?
Yeah.
Jeez. Yeah, no, that's the kind of stuff I guess we need to focus on. None of this, women being, young women being assaulted in bathrooms.
Well, and what makes that article even more cynical, and I think Blue pointed this out in the chat, I guess I had missed over it, is that apparently they're using the logic of, oh, she was asking for it, like they were consenting to sex.
Yes, I saw that. Yeah.
And it was just absolutely awful, because it's just like, I'm just thinking, let's go back 4 or 5 years, and this just tells us how far things have fallen, where we go back to Mattress Girl, we go back to like yes means yes,
Yeah.
and consent is important, to
we're literally getting at affirmative consent laws where, like, at every stage of a sexual encounter, people need to like sign a form. But this girl was asking for it by being in a girl's bathroom.
Yeah, I didn't know that a high school girls' restroom was a prominent cruising zone. Like, this is just how bad it's gotten. And I mean, this is where we're at. And what I think is really telling is that your schools are not safe, and the reaction to this has been across the country, not just Virginia. A drop in public school attendance, California especially, the research into how to actually homeschool, which is one of the few rights that most parents still have in the United States. It's a promising sign, and I think that if there was a entrepreneurial sort of dissident right winger out there listening, that would be to start setting up your own school systems and networking with disaffected teachers and parents, and have them like work together to have a communal curriculum that is not based on this blood libel. And I mean, even for older people such as ourselves, I mean, hey, the academic agency is a thing. Michael Millerman's philosophy is a thing.
I was going to say,
there.
We're seeing a lot of this now starting to pop up with Academic Agent and Michael Milliman and these kind of guys doing university courses. But I think you're absolutely right. We really need to see people developing these curriculums, these easy to plug and play curriculums for homeschooling, because it's absolutely necessary, and you should be doing it anyway, just because like rescuing kids from this is super important, and giving parents a realistic way to do this without rearranging their lives entirely is essential if you want to make this happen. I know everyone's like, well, you should just quit your jobs and homeschool your kids or whatever, but like giving people an on-ramp to this is super important. But also, this is going to be a booming industry, and so I think it's a really good opportunity. We talk so much about alternative institutions, and they always seem so far away and so difficult, but this is something we have seen people in our sphere do successfully at higher levels. There's no reason you shouldn't be able to do this at state levels, right?
Yeah, and not to mention, a variety of states here in America have that infrastructure available to you. I know, speaking from my state of Texas, that there's associations, and there's homeschooling resources for parents to do it. But I think what makes it so daunting of a task, right, unless you have the capital or the entrepreneurial means to do it, is that the United States is an economy, to sort of take the whole boat in line here. It's based on credit and usury, where you can do out and go buy whatever you want. And if you're hungry, you can order a pizza at 3 a.m. and a small, Albanian man will come deliver it to you on a small motorbike. And we're at that point because we talk about financial literacy all of the time. in the United States, where the average American doesn't have like $500 in their savings account for an emergency expense. And so there's sort of that demoralized financial aspect when we talk about building these things, because if you're not well off, if you're not doing considerably well for yourself, and if you do live in the cities and you're living in an IQ shredder where you are unable to really raise your kids and you're dependent more or less to go to work to keep a roof over your head and also to pay for child support, like at a daycare, it's a really vicious cycle. And I think that at least these conversations about parental rights and about the, children consenting and blood libel being taught in schools, if that's not a wake up call to you, as the meme goes, you're not going to make it. You can
Mhm.
support it and have a middle income, and a middle class lifestyle, but this means that Americans are going to have to learn the meaning of frugality for the first time in a
Mhm.
long time. And those are essential things. But you're absolutely right that this is a potential for a booming industry, and nothing should stop us from targeting the kids, because the kids, of course, are always the next generation. They're the ones that are going to be socialized and participate in government and society, not necessarily the Gen Xers or boomers that are, looking over this and just complaining or yelling at their TVs and radios, because you can be a Trump voting, 50 something year old Republican. But if you're going to like turn on Amazon or HBO and see Blood Libel, the TV show number 25 and stream it, and then tell your kids, hey, this was a good show, you should go watch it. What good are you doing? And that's where we're
Yeah.
at.
Well, and I think BAP and a number of other people have made this point where you have a lot of people, myself included, who talk about the importance of having families and the investing in the next generation. But simply having the children isn't enough. If you're going to have children, you're going to have a family, and then they're immediately just going to be indoctrinated into woke gender theory and stuff by the state, then you're just having people who are going to be groomed by the state for terrible lifestyles. You've got to go beyond that. You've got to go to the next step. And so I think you're right that people are just going to have to learn how to do that. But at the same time, I'm also hesitant when people are always like, oh well, you people are just going to have to figure it out, because I think a lot of that does miss um, most people are not super online, super aware of the culture war and everything that's going on. Most people are having normal lives, and if you don't give people with normal lives the ability to make it, like everyone's just not going to make it because they're not wildly online plugged in. I think that's dangerous. I think you do have to have a plan that does include people who aren't 100% aware of everything that's going on, and giving them an option once they kind of wake up to kind of get up to speed and kind of protect their kids from some of this stuff.
Yeah, I mean, it makes you just wonder, right, what it would be like if someone wasn't overly online and they woke up the next day. It's like, oh, things are just fine. It's like 2009, and then they like wake up and it's 2021, and they see exactly what on earth has just happened and how
Yeah.
quickly things have accelerated. I can't imagine what kind of a shock that is, and I think that's why we're seeing such energy from Loudoun County's like parents, because even though it's an affluent, majority white neighborhood near the DC suburbs area. I mean, imagine like this is it, and like, oh, the things that you've been voting on a ticket line basis, have come home to roost. The leopards I voted for finally ate my face, kind of situation. Um, I think that's why we're seeing the response. But you're absolutely right. We need to make these things accessible, and this requires people to actually do things on the ground. Um, I mean, a great way to do this, right? And I talked about this in a video yesterday about like even just trying to find tradition and stuff like that. Is it's just if you start putting yourself out there, just saying, "Hey, I'm so and so. This is what I do. I provide education for homeschooling." I mean, there are business networking mixers are a thing. Meeting with subject matter experts are a thing. I mean, these things are available. I think that you're right that oftentimes the two online fails to acknowledge the average ordinary person just working paycheck to paycheck.
Well, there's a reason that the red pill meme is still with us, because it really is. Sometimes people really do have that shock where one day you're walking around. going to your job, getting a steak, and then the next day you realize humanity's been wiped out and being used as batteries. Like you really do. You have people who just wake up the next day and realize, oh man, this is everything is much much worse. And when they do hit that shock, you have to, like I said, they're just having a way for normal people to make that transition without, like, having to go read Decline of the West or or Julius Evola or something seems pretty important if you want to have people be able to raise their kids in something reasonable. But let's take a look at some more of these super chats, because I do want to wrap it up. We are coming up on an hour. Guys, if you have any questions for me or the Prudentialist, go ahead and put them in now. We'll make sure to get everything before we go. Lance here says, if you could get all of these parents upset by what's going on in school to read or watch one piece of media, what would it be? That's a really good question. One thing. It's that, I guess the hard part of that one is you're just wondering about accessibility. There's so many, because obviously, like, a lot of the things that explain more of this stuff in depth kind of fly over the head of some. I mean, obviously, when you look at the work of someone like Rufo, that's probably the most accessible thing uh, to get them to understand. There's a lot of entry level stuff that I think is good stuff, like Why Liberalism Failed or Christopher Caldwell's Age of Entitlement. But even those are a little tall order for kind of some of your average readers. I don't know. Is there one thing that comes to mind for you?
I mean, I think the most accessible would be to look up Christopher Rufo, because he has a website that details all of this.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, if you wanted to get somebody's shock value, I would say either that recent thing in Kentucky with the students dressed very scantily, male students on male
Yeah.
administrative staff.
Yeah.
That, or maybe the Rutgers professor that says just white people need to be taken out before we run out of time to do it. Those
Yep.
would probably be my two go-to shock value, but Rufo has the resources and he has the receipts.
Yeah. Yeah. I think you're right that just, from a very dry news sense, like, he lays it out in a way that is very easy for people to, it's hard to deny when you see him lay it out the way he does. Lance also says, what can I do to avoid missing Frog of the Week? I'm pretty sure he's talking about your channel. What's Frog of the Week? What's
Oh, so every
people look
Sunday
for?
I give commentary on geopolitics and international relations, and oftentimes the lectures can be dry, dour, and dark. So I end it by just covering a different frog of the week. That's how the show concludes. Lance, what do you want to do to avoid it? Just go tune in every Sunday at 3 p.m. Eastern, where we cover geopolitical affairs, international relations theory, and briefings on hot spots around the world.
And then we have Bolero 393. We need to have children and keep them safe, like Whitney Houston told us in The Greatest Love of All. I can't say I'm familiar with that Whitney Houston reference. My repertoire with Whitney Houston is pretty limited. But yes, I do think.
I am unfortunately terribly familiar with that
Oh
song.
no. Okay.
I worked at a nonprofit where the owner, we worked with children and food, and every year she would do this sort of like pageantry sort of deal, and that would be her song every year, all the time. I hate it so much.
Yeah, I'm familiar with Muzak being, I used to love certain bands, and then when I was working, retail in high school and college, having to hear a specific song 9,000 times just made sure I could never listen to it again. Polish Ambassador says, thank you for your donation. Build your own X. Didn't that test fail already? Yeah, so I understand this pushback. I see this pretty regularly. People saying, don't we know what happens when you build your own? Won't the state just come for it? Won't they just tear it down? And the answer to some of that is yes, right? Like, none of this is completely safe. None of this is guaranteed. None of this is guaranteed to last or be protected. All of that is true. But at the same time, I think that's also just in many ways for people then excuse to do nothing, because then it's, oh well, why, then there's no point building things, there's no point working towards the stuff because it's all just gonna get consumed anyway. This, not to call people out online, but there are certain people who criticize me online for saying, like, at some point, like, bad governments fail and you should be ready for them, and they're just like, no, this can go on forever, and that's never going to happen, and this, the regime is all powerful for all time, there are never any consequences for mismanaging or abusing, there's never any consequence for ineptness, and these people just be in power forever and they'll always be able to crush you no matter what. And if that's the line you want to take, then you can do that, I guess. Like, if you really think that the American regime is the one empire in history that's just going to exist in perpetuity and never pay a cost for mismanagement or bioleninism, then okay, you can take that tack, I guess. But my outlook is, that you need to have a counter elite available. You need to have institutions. You need to have people who are willing to pick things up when they get dropped. And does that mean that they'll always exist with no pushback? No. But I mean, okay, this stuff is coming no matter what. So you might as well build something of value that can help people out in the meantime.
Yeah, and I think Yarvin kind of said it best that no empire lasts forever, but they always have plans to last forever.
Right.
And I mean, you have to, the regime will do whatever it can, right? And especially as a regime deteriorates and starts paying the cost for its terrible decisions, it will thrash inwardly. Which is why, the famous go along about, decline is that, Roman elites will send correspondence to each other and have all of this flourishing language apologizing why they couldn't go, saying that the roads weren't safe, but no one talked about why the roads weren't safe,
Right. Right.
And that's kind of where we're at. I mean, yeah, things are probably going to get hurt when about building things, and there's probably going to be costs to individuals. But if even in places like South Africa, where AfriForum, I'm going to give Conscious Caracol a really great shout out here, and if you're not subscribed to him, you should, because it's a really good wake up call for what's coming to the United States. If AfriForum can build their own university in South Africa while the governing, coalition of the ANC celebrates over a pump water fountain, then clearly there are some things that need to happen here to make it work. I'm not saying that it's going to work and succeed every time. We know this, especially with social media. I think, Gab constantly has to get canceled by banks and canceled by ad revenue processors and get attacked by the ADL. And they're still standing. They're building up their own ad services, their own financial institutions. And if that's what we have to do it, then I think what requires us is that our talk online has to meet the walk in the real world. And that's what I would have to say there is, they want you demoralized, atomized, and accepting for the fact that you should be subjugated. You cannot buy into that framework.
And necessity is what builds a lot of this stuff, right? Like, a lot of times people just aren't willing to do something until they have to. And so in some ways, the pressure that comes with that kind of persecution and them going after these individual agencies is then what forces people to then build the alternatives that work. And then when supply lines collapse and your banking system fails and all this stuff comes apart, you at least have people who have something set up, who know how to build things, who know how to make alternatives, and that's important. Lance, again, thanks again, man. Can you tell me about the Rutgers professor? Yeah, it was the professor. She was just like the Prudentialist was saying. She was just going on about how white people were terrible, and you have to get rid of, they're doing terrible things, and they have to be pushed out because they just it's exactly what you expected. And kind of the right wing response was to call people and be like, hey, Rutgers, are these the kind of people you want speaking for your school? And I think the answer is pretty obviously yes, right? Like, they not only are these the kind of people, like they're not embarrassed, I think, in most cases by these people. They go out of their way to select and promote them and publicize the fact that they are putting them in positions of power. So in some ways good, I guess, to to advertise what is being celebrated in universities, but obviously ridiculous.
Yeah, and I mean, also, I think her name is Brittany Cooper. She did a TED talk a few years
I
back
saw that.
saying,
Yeah,
yeah, that time as a concept is a white people thing, which that has its own can of worms that you can make the
yeah.
joke yourself for.
One of those Richard Spencer or college professor moments, right? Like which one said it,
Yeah,
but white people created times. Like, okay, all right, based, I guess. I don't know. Um,
chuck up another W, boys.
right? Yeah, seems pretty amazing. All right, so um, Bolero says, I think it's difficult for contemporary people in democracies to think in terms of decades and centuries instead of 2 to 6 years, myself included. I think that's absolutely right, man. Like we talk about, obviously, Hoppe is a great read for this, Democracy, the God That Failed. And he talks about how democracy incentivizes rulers to basically just, fleece uh, the people as quickly as possible because of the limited amount of time they have to rule, and you might as well burn it all down if you can't eat it because you don't want your opponent to have it. And that doesn't just impact the rulers. I think that also impacts the rules and ruled. And like you said, we tend to think of the short term because we are incentivized to think in the short term by our actual electoral system.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the best take I think you can have on that, especially for a lot of us in the West, is that the average public only thinks in terms of like every 4 years because elections. But we need to return to a time where we thought about the next generation, the generation after that, where people the old proverb about planting a tree that you will not live to sit underneath its shade.
Absolutely. Let's see. Hunter Counts says this all stops when the money runs out. Gibbs stop. Colleges lose their students, and mercenaries leave. Also, you should stream with Louis Levi. So yeah, I think in some ways that's true. Like at some point the party stops, but I think that the ruling class is working as hard as possible to find the ways to extend that. That's why you see them trying to bring in new populations to work, use the slave labor so they can basically just crush what's left out of the kulaks. But at some point, there are no more middle class people to bleed dry. Um, and I think you're right that eventually that does come to an end. And when you see that, then you see all the hangers on and all the people, the industries that were built around living off of the regime and its ability to pump money and power out of the middle of America eventually does start to collapse, and those people leave. Also, I haven't seen. I mean, I know I'm familiar with Louis. He used to be with Sargon, right? He's one of Sargon's buddies.
Yeah.
But I really have not seen anything from him for a long time.
Well, he
Uh,
streams most of the time.
does he? Okay.
Yeah, but I mean, he does like news coverage and things, but he also does a series called Copcast where he just talks about like the police just taking down criminals and how like their footage kind of illustrates the real dangers that exist in the
Mhm.
streets. It'd be a fun time if you wanted to be spicy for a couple hours.
Okay, yeah, it's one of those things where I still watch some of my favorites, but my like YouTube consumption has gone down as my YouTube creation has gone up. Like I just I'm trying to read more. I'm trying to get stuff for and produce content, and so I just don't. I'm not up in the familiar with the internet world and creators as much as I was 5-6 years ago when I was strictly a consumer. But yeah, I'd be I've been talking to a lot of people lately, been on different podcasts and streams and stuff. So if anyone sets that up or anything, I'd be more than happy to talk. Let's see. Mr. Patriarch here says unwoke public schools can exist in small towns. They can tactically nullify the feds. Don't send your kids to public schools, but we can infiltrate too. Yeah, I think that there's probably some truth that I'm going to be honest. I think it's increasingly difficult because, especially due to the way funding is structured in the United States education system, to have unwoke public schools, even in small towns. Obviously, it does. That doesn't mean it doesn't matter who's teaching your kids, who's on the school boards. who's your governor, your county commissioners, like all that stuff does alter the level of wokeness and that kind of things. But without going into an insane amount of detail, uh, due to my time in politics and reporting and other things, I am very familiar with the way these things are funded. And it is basically impossible to keep the federal government out of your school at this point. Most of your schools have intentionally been made dependent on federal funding and federal testing and standards that from which they must comply, and they functionally are required to teach this stuff.
And as someone who lives in the small town of America, right, where I went from a very large, well-known city to now living in the middle of nowhere, where it's like, yeah, parents are on school boards and they're very invested in what they do, and they talk about kids and how the school is doing after church. But the problem with that is where they'll tear down Paradise and put up a parking lot, and there'll be more development, there'll be more people coming in, and you unless you are exclusively and militantly gatekeeping, which I think you should be doing, especially if you live in a small town like I do. The problem is that there will be development. If you're not too far from a city, the increasing urban sprawl will metastasize before your eyes, and it will come there. But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't be being involved, because there is a lot that you can still do, especially because 90% of funding with schools does come locally, 10% from the feds, and that's been the case for a long time now. But again, Auron makes a good point that it's state and federal regulations that also have an impact on the curricula being taught.
Yeah, you have a lot of this stuff woven into the money that flows down. You might not be able to build roads in your area if you don't teach what the federal government wants you to teach in the school. That's the kind of stuff that does get woven in there, and so again, there is a lot you can do locally. It's not saying don't do it locally. I'm just saying there are. It's difficult to completely shield even your small schools that are publicly funded from some of this. Let's see. Polish ambassador again. Thank you, sir. I didn't mean to demoralize, just pointing out that singular emergency plan is a bad plan by default. Several positions should be at a minimum. Cheers. Yeah, man. And I know that's not what you were saying specifically. I'm just saying, I think that if you do take strictly that look, then it can be demoralizing. But you're right. Like, obviously, just building your own isn't the only thing. If you completely withdraw, if you try to do the Amish thing, that sounds great until the state decides that they're not going to like let you have your community anymore. So obviously, like, just doing your own thing is not in and of itself an answer. And you're right that you do have to still keep a foot in the real world and that kind of thing. So I think you're right about that. And then Yiz came by just to say hello. Hello, Yiz. How's it going? But that said, we are over an hour, and I do need to go ahead and call it a day. So thanks everybody for coming by. Thank you for the super chats, and we had a great. We actually had a nice turnout. So thanks everybody for coming by, and of course, thank you to the Prudentialist for coming on, man.
Oh, thank you. Happy to be here.
And again, of course, if you're not checking out his channel, links to his channel and to his Twitter are down in the description. If it's your first time coming by my channel, please go ahead and subscribe. And also make sure to check out alternative platforms. I know, I've got the Odyssey and the Rumble channel. Are you on other platforms as well, Prudential?
I'm working on it. I'm putting my backup stuff on BitChute, and I'm setting up an Odyssey stuff so I can have more exclusive content there. I'm on Substack as well, and I'm putting up together Minds and I think Gab as well in the near future. So I'm doing my best to slowly creep over to the alt sites as well.
Yeah, I have a hard time doing the alt social media stuff because, like, I feel like I'm just trying to keep up with multiple platforms and posts. That kind of stuff is difficult, but I certainly try to do it with the video because it is only, you just never know when
No, that's absolutely
you're going to
true.
drop the hammer. And so, everybody make sure that you follow people in places that aren't YouTube, because you only know it's only a matter of time before you're going to have to watch that content or Odyssey or something.
Our days are limited.
Yeah. So make sure to do that. All right, guys. Again, thanks for coming by. And as always, we'll talk to you next time.